Some politics now. I think I said Tuesday night, I think I got on a little bit of it. Along about the 5th century, we begin to see the Teutons, the Germanic tribes, beginning to be known as the Vandals, the Goths, the Visigoths, and the Ostrogoths. The Visigoths are in the west, and the Ostrogoths are in the east. And these are simply tribes, but they're warring tribes that have chieftains, and they're moving all over Europe. Not only them, but the Huns from Mongolia. We know Attila the Hun. We know that name. He begins to move his hordes, and they begin warring all over. The Roman Empire is weakening politically, not religiously. The Roman Empire is strengthening religiously, but politically she's weakening, which doesn't matter. Because you see, this harlot is about to get on a different steed. And we're going to see that steed. Now she's got a problem. The only way she can perpetuate her religion is not through evangelism. It's not attractive. They can't do it. She must perpetuate her religion through the sword. And the only way she can truly do that is to get involved with political powers and control those political powers. And this is what she begins to do through these pagan tribal chieftains. Alaric moves into Rome in the 5th century. He sacks Rome and takes Rome. But that really isn't a problem for the Pope, because all he's going to do is make Catholics out of them, because he's going to say, hey boy, I'll make a deal with you. You bring them to me and I'll bring them to you. That's simplified, but that's exactly what they did. And so the Goths and the Vandals and the Huns, Leo supposedly stops old Attila the Hun, and they finally go off. The reason they went out of existence, they didn't have enough sense to know how to make shoes. When they couldn't live on horseback, they couldn't walk. They didn't know how to make shoes. Anyway, I'll throw that in. All right, what we begin to do now, we see Alaric, Augustine, Bishop of Hippo, whose big work was the city of God. And what he introduces the city of God with is a defense and a defense of the Romans and an encouragement for the Roman people, because they had been sacked and the women had been raped and all of that. That's what Augustine's all about. But he writes this city of God. And one thing about Augustine, he may have had a few good doctrines, but Augustine was a state Catholic. I mean, he was a state Catholic, and he believed that the church had the right, the sovereign right, to rule the world. And that's what that city of God was all about, his idealistic city, and that's what established the theology and the platform of the Roman Catholic Church. He also writes against the Donatists. And then we find the Vandals sack Rome, and then they disappear. And then we find the Byzantine Empire beginning to rise in the east, in Asia Minor, or Turkey as we know it today. Byzantium and all that. There begins to be a split in the Catholic Church, the Greek and the Roman Catholic, and it's already moving right there. Then we find more movement in Europe. The Burgundians move into France. The Lombards move into northern Italy. The Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes, they move over into Britain, and they finally remain there, and that's why they're known as Anglo-Saxons. They did not move into Wales, nor Scotland, nor Ireland. Those Celtic tribes remained pure. But at any rate, we find after the Lombards and the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes, we find the rise of a kingdom called the Franks. And this is very germane to our situation, because ultimately the Frankish Empire becomes the empire that rules Europe, Middle Ages in Europe. The first house was the house of Merovech, the Merovingians, a man by the name of Clovis. Now he becomes a Catholic. Clovis becomes a Catholic. That's significant. Clovis is a conqueror. He's even more of a conqueror than those that preceded him. But he becomes a Catholic. And you got to understand that. What more can I say about these groups? They're all Baptists. But how is the Pope going to control Europe? Clovis becomes a Catholic. And when he makes his deal with the Catholics, every group, every country, every state, every tribe that he conquers, they take the sword and they force them to bow to the Pope. He becomes a defender of the faith of the Roman Catholic Church. He begins to wield the crown with the Pope. After Clovis, there's Charles Martel. Now I've got to break right here, because about this time, there's the rise of something else. Something that is a very big problem in the United States and the world today. And that is the rise of the Muslims. There's a fellow by the name of Muhammad towards the last of the 6th century who is an illiterate sheep herder living in Saudi Arabia. There are two cities you'll remember, Medina and Mecca. But this fellow is an illiterate herdsman. Now, I'm going to tell you something about him. You may not know. He was an Arab. He was a pagan, as all Arabs were. Muhammad finds a wife, or rather a wife finds Muhammad. And her name is Khadijah. Now, you know who Khadijah was? She was a rich widow who was a Catholic who was in cahoots with the Pope. There were two popes about this time, Boniface V and Honorius I. You can find very little about those two dudes in history. They're there all right, but they've struck them out all they can. You know what these two men did? They struck a deal with Khadijah. They've got to get the Jews. They've got to get Jerusalem. They've got to get control of the Holy Land. They know the Arabs have a built-in hatred for the Jews. That's family squabble. Been squabbling ever since a long time ago. Ishmael, you know? Wild man. They devised another religion in order to control Israel. And they used the Arabs to do it. They used Muhammad, an illiterate sheep herder. You got to remember that. How did he write the Koran? Where did he get all them ideas? Khadijah marries him. He's a spirited type fella. And if you've ever read the Koran, anybody ever read in it? I haven't read all. I've got one. I've read parts of it. And it does teach violence. Terrible violence. And you know what it does? It panders to the beliefs of the Arabs anyhow. The only difference they've got is that they're now no longer polytheists. They've become monotheists. But who do the Muslims call God? What's his name? Allah? Hang on to that. They say Abraham. They look back to Abraham. They say they worship the God of Abraham. Give me a chapter and verse where Abraham called him Allah. Did you ever think about that? Now let me tell you what. This Muslim thing's big trouble. It's causing trouble all over this world. It didn't just start, folks. You get your map and you find out right down here in the Arabian desert is where this thing started. And I want you to know by the year, and we're talking about by the early 600s, and within 100 years, the Muslims had conquered all over here, all over Asia Minor, Turkey, Armenia, all over Arabia, all over northern Africa. They crossed the Mediterranean there to Gibraltar. They moved up into Spain. They moved across the Pyrenees Mountains. They moved up into Gaul or southern France, and they moved all the way up into France to a place called Tours. in 100 years with their sword. Now, how in the world did they get the name Allah? They had a blockhouse in Arabia. The pagans did, the pagan Arabs. They're still pagan Arabs. And they had a whole house full of gods. And Muhammad went in there and chose one of them. And his name was Allah. One of their old pagan gods was named Allah. But Muhammad, the Catholics have already taught him this so-called monotheism. And he got to pick a god, and he picks Allah. Now, the book of 1 Corinthians tells us that an idol has a demon behind it. Every idol has a demon behind it. Don't think they're moot issues. Don't think they're neutral. You walk by an idol. Don't you think that idol is nothing. It's got a demon perpetuating it. I get spooky and I go into Catholic hospital. I don't like them. Well, I'll tell you what, when I was going to Lexington Baptist College, I was painting houses. Worst day I ever had in my life. I was in a Catholic house, a doctor's house, painting it. He had them idols all over, and I knocked one of them stupid things over and broke it. I'd like to throw it away, but it wasn't mine. I had to fix the stupid thing. Worst day I ever had in my life. You know who the poor Muslims are worshiping, folks? A demon. My God's name is not Allah. Abraham's God is not Allah. Abraham's God is the Lord. Elohim, Yahweh. That's who they're worshiping. But friends, they're a warfaring tribe. And they were mighty wicked, and they still are as far as their warfaring. Charles Martel made himself king, beginning the Carolingian house, and he organized the Franks, and he met the Muslims at Tours in 732, and he defeated them. Like it or not, he probably did stop the movement of Mohammedanism into France, or else they could have taken over all France, and we might have been bound to Allah by the sword. So Charles Martel stops the move, and this brings him into prominence. His son Pepin the Short and then we find Charlemagne, or Charlemagne, son of Pepin the Short. Charles the Great. Something happens here that is very significant. On Christmas Day, December the 25th, 800 A.D., Charlemagne visits the Pope to go celebrate Christ Mass. And as he knelt down, the Pope sets a crown on his head. And when he stood up, the Pope says, "Caesar Augustus, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, defender of the faith." Now is the Holy Roman Empire. See, you were told in history that the Roman Empire died in 476 A.D., never was heard from again. If you'd listened to Daniel, you'd known better, because you see those two legs of iron and the feet of iron and the clay and the toes of clay mixed, partly mixed, never did die. One of those legs is political, one of those legs is religious. Of that image, you know, in Daniel we talked about the other night. Now we have the establishment of the Holy Roman Empire, the 1,000-year Reich. How many of you remember about Adolf Hitler? Adolf Hitler, and what did he establish in Germany? The Third Reich. Folks, I bet you never asked what was the Second Reich, nor what was the First Reich. I just told you what the First Reich was. Charlemagne's empire, the Holy Roman Empire. Lasted for 1,000 years, but took you about the 1800. And the Kaiser's Reich was the Second Reich. Didn't last that long. But Adolf Hitler was simply starting the Third Reich, and he said it was going to be a 1,000-year Reich. Adolf Hitler was simply a product of history, not justifying him. But if anybody had ever read this history and put it together right, they should exactly know what Adolf Hitler was going to do and every move he was going to make. Why do you think he and Italy were allied? What do you think the Frankish, which was a German, that's the beginning of the Germans, and why do you think, who was he allied with? Who was Charlemagne allied with? Italy, the Pope. They've been allied all along. There's your First, Second, and Third Reich. And every move that Adolf Hitler took, he took it, he moved into France, he thought France belonged to him. Because Charlemagne owned France. Charlemagne owned Germany, he owned the Netherlands. He owned Austria. He owned the Rhineland. He was doing it all. And something else he also did, he hated Jews. You know, when Adolf Hitler died, the Pope at Rome said, just as the Pope said with Charlemagne, he said, the defender of the faith has fallen. He was financed, aided, and abetted by the Pope. There's no question about it. You say, well, what's all that got to do with us? Let me tell you what. Through these, look at the line here, and here, dark ages, all the way up into the 17th century. Modern day historians are trying to, the revisionist historians are trying to rewrite history. They're trying to say things wasn't what they were, but they were what they were. And it is a lie to say that they were not dark ages. Why were they dark ages? They were dark ages because through the joining of the Pope with the Franks, and all of Europe was controlled by the Pope. Now listen, Charlemagne had power. But what about that dude that put the crown on his head? There's a message there, folks. If I can crown you, I can uncrown you. And you see, look up here. By this date, the Pope actually exercised that power and deposed Frederick. He had kings crawling to the Pope, begging the Pope's forgiveness. Now, folks, that's power. When a king crawls to you and begs your forgiveness and begs you to put him back on the throne, you got power. Oh, speaking of kings, who is it that you know that travels around sitting on the shoulders of men? You might have seen a Pharaoh back in ancient Egypt doing that. But we're talking the 20th century. We're talking the 90s. And we still got a dude that rides around on the shoulders of human beings. We're still talking about a dude who stands out here and people grovel to kiss his feet, to kiss his ring. They'll die to kiss his ring. Have you ever seen the Pope travel? Have you ever seen him in his Pope mobile? He's got a plane at least as fancy as the President of the United States, but even more so, he's got a greater entourage. Got his own 747, and when he travels, my friend, this world bends for him. They bow for him. The liberal news media bows for him. I never will forget when the old Pope came to Iowa one time. You know where Iowa is? It's out there in the Corn Belt. There ain't nothing in Iowa but farmers. That's all they are. Nothing wrong with them, but that's what's in Iowa. The Pope, and I mean, he went out there and he spoke to those people. And the news media said, oh, it was wonderful. It was profound. It was beautiful. The Pope said, you are farmers. You live close to the earth. We must have peace. among men. It was marvelous. It was a miracle. That's what they said. If you recall, they went hog wild and pig crazy over it. Now, got to move on. Got to move on. We talked about the councils, many of those councils, and the councils of Constance, and go on. That's a separate study in itself. And every time they have a council, they change something. Indulgences, purgatory. Now, there are debates. It is debatable when some of these things started exactly. Nobody knows for sure, because they had been doing it for a long time before it was ever made canon law. But we simply have a date that this is when it became official, but that's not to say it just started. Remember, I told you that Zoroastrianism, Persian dualism, was very similar to Roman Catholic worship today. They had a heaven, they had a hell, and they had a purgatory. How many of you have ever seen an Egyptian tomb at a museum? Now, I don't know what y'all got out here, but in Louisville, Kentucky, they've got a natural history museum, and upstairs in that thing, they've got a complete facsimile, and much of it is real stuff, of the insides of an Egyptian tomb. And I thought it was awful interesting. They had a movie there, showed you how to embalm a body, and you know like they did, wrap them up and make a mummy. Didn't show us how to make a daddy, but they showed how to make a mummy. But anyway, all around the walls, they got little funny pictures. And all of these things are representative of something. And they explained it all. And it showed the path of a human being when he dies, and when he goes into that never, never land. In Egyptian theology, a soul went into purgatory. In Persian theology, a soul went into purgatory. It was just a matter of time before the Catholics came up with purgatory. After all, they're nothing but sun god worshipers. I've shown you from Constantine on. It cannot be denied. You know, I've never been challenged on any of this stuff. I've done this all over the place, and I've never been challenged one time. People don't like it. They hate my guts. They'd love to dance on my grave, but I've never had one bring any fact and try to prove me wrong. They've said he ought to be shut up. They've said he ought to be kicked off the radio, and I have been. But they've never said I was wrong. And you can't, these things are not fiction, they're fact. They're facts of history. All right. So where did this thing of purgatory come from? Huh? Listen, the Bible talks about heaven, and it talks about hell. Heaven's up, hell's down. Oh, you know where they are? Well, I got an idea. If heaven's up, we got to go past where the astronauts go. That's the third one. Paul said I was caught up to the third heaven. There's the first heaven and the second and the third heavens that way. And I know that you ain't going to shoot up there with a rocket ship. There ain't but one way you're going to get there. I am the way, the truth, and life. No man cometh unto the Father but by me. And hell is down. Center of the earth. It's hot down there. Everybody agrees it's hot down there. Where in the Bible does it say there's a place halfway between? Doesn't say it. It's not there. There's no justification for purgatory in the Bible. Whoever had this idea? Oh, the Persians, the Egyptians. That's where the idea came from. But they thought they might make a buck or two once they get it. And see, the idea is that purgatory, that's where you go to purge your sins. So you're suffering in purgatory. Now, when you die, everybody dies and goes to purgatory unless you happen to be St. Teresa or Mother Teresa or somebody like that, and they're so good that they already got everything cleared up here, and they go right straight to heaven, only they build up a big credit account. They got more good works than they need. But now here, me and you just common old sinners, and we die and we go to purgatory, and how are we going to get out of there? It takes somebody who's alive to get you out of there. And how's he going to go about doing that? You see, after you die, if you've got somebody alive that loved you, then they have a mass for you. Now, the old Irish folk used to say, low money, low mass. High money, high mass. No money, no mass. It's that way in Mexico. It's that way in South America. It's that way in Europe. It's that way in the United States. You see, John F. Kennedy died. Boys, they had a high mass for him. They had it all the way at Rome. I mean, they had a big one. Wonder how much they paid for that. Now, you don't know exactly when your loved one gets out of purgatory. That same house where I broke that idol. Now, these dudes he was a dentist and she was a dentist. I mean, they was educated. And just show you that education doesn't make you smart when it comes to God, these poor fools, they had a little card over every light switch plate, encased in plastic. And I read it. It was the prayer of St. Francis of Assisi. St. Francis of Assisi. Excuse me. And in 1860-something, whoever the Pope was, by papal bull such and such a number, the Pope had decreed that every time you recite the prayer of St. Francis of Assisi, that you receive 360 days indulgences. Now what that means is you get 360 days off of your sentence. I couldn't wait till they got home. I said, Doc, do you all believe this? Well, sure. You mean you believe that every time you say this prayer, that you get 360 days off of your time in purgatory? Yeah. I said, did you ever wonder how many days you got left? No, they'd never thought about that. I'll tell you what, brother, if I owe you money, I want a receipt. Every payment I make, I want a receipt. Because I want to know how much more I owe you. I'm not going to just pay you payment after payment after payment, and I want an accountant of it, because you might get me paying that thing all the rest of my life. Never will get done with this dude. And that's exactly the issue. How long can they collect off of one dead body? The rest of the life of anybody who cares. And they do it. I know one that did it. 9-story condominium. Me and my partner up on the outside of that booger swinging, painting and caulking and stuff, and we watch this priest, retired priest, and he wears civilian clothes until he gets broke. Then he puts on his garb and turns his collar around backwards. And this fellow, the building manager, said, "Hey, where's the priest going? Where's the Holy Joe going?" He going out to get some money. He low on money. He got his garb on. He's going out to some of these rich widows, and he's going to have a mass for them. They're going to say prayers for the dead and get some money from them, because they're still praying for them to get them out of purgatory that doesn't exist. I'm not a fan of Jimmy Swaggart. Never was. I don't support those kind of people. I preached against that ever since I've been in the ministry. I preached against that. I'd be amazed if anybody in my church ever sent one of those dudes $1. Jimmy Swaggart, Baker, Jim Baker, and all those guys. But I'm telling you that all of them put together, they have not extorted as much money as the Roman Catholic Church extorts from this country every day of the year. And they do it, and I said extortion. If you don't like it, I done said it. To take money from somebody to say that you're paying their dead relative out of a purgatory that doesn't exist is extortion. And it ought to be prosecuted. Folks, I got to quit. I ain't near where I ought to be. Saint and image worship. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image or any likeness of anything in heaven above or earth beneath or in the waters beneath, that you bow down to them. How plain is it got to be? I mean, we're talking about number 1 and 2 of the top 10. The orders. They start. Why would they start these so-called orders of the clergy? Orders of the clergy. Where would they get the idea? They came right straight from paganism. They start the Cistercians. They start the Benedictines, 529. The Cistercians and the Carmelites, and we move on to all of these various orders. And I want to get on all that tonight. But folks, the Dark Ages means that they were dark with the blood of Anabaptists. But these people did not give in, my friends. They loved not their lives even unto the death, but they loved their Lord. They were faithful unto the death. I was going to try to get to the Crusades up here at 1000. The Pope starts the Crusades. Let me get that just a minute, because I have so much tomorrow night I won't even begin to get done. There were at least about 12 Crusades. What were the Crusades about? You see, the Muslims got out of hand, and they take over Israel and Jerusalem. And so the popes want to get it back. Oh, I know what I was going to tell you. When you listen to the news, and you think about that Muslim Arab world that exists today, in Lebanon, Syria, and all those countries, but there's always some problems in Lebanon because you got the battle of the Christians and the Muslims. Now you think about all of that world just engulfing the world with Muslims, and you got one little pocket of Catholics. Now we say Christians, they're Catholics, not Christians. How in the world did they get there? It was that deal made with the Pope, that piece remained Catholic, and it's still Catholic to this day. They haven't. You know, the Catholics they've got a mass for the Muslims. They have a Muslim mass. You know what Muslims? Islam means to submit. And a Muslim is one who has submitted. And the goal of the Muslim is to force you and me to submit. And that's what they use the sword for. But they haven't taken all of Lebanon in all these years. Anyway, that's what the Crusade's about. The first Crusade, so-called Peter the Hermit. Now listen to what the Catholic did to get these battles going. He granted plenary indulgence. Before they ever sinned, before they ever did anything, he said, if you'll go fight for me, I'll forgive you everything you do before you ever do it, so go ahead and do it because you're already forgiven for it. Now, if you really believe that dude had that power, you'd be home free, wouldn't you? And that's exactly what they were. The word crusade comes from the word But folks, the Dark Ages means that they were dark with the blood of Anabaptists. But these people did not give in, my friends. They loved not their lives even unto the death, but they loved their Lord. They were faithful unto the death. I was going to try to get to the Crusades up here at 1000. The Pope starts the Crusades. Let me get that just a minute because I have so much tomorrow night I won't even begin to get done. There were at least about 12 Crusades. What were the Crusades about? You see, the Muslims got out of hand, and they take over Israel and Jerusalem. And so the popes want to get it back. Oh, I know what I was going to tell you. When you listen to the news, and you think about that Muslim Arab world that exists today, in Lebanon, Syria, and all those countries, but there's always some problem in Lebanon because you got the battle of the Christians and the Muslims. Now you think about all of that world just engulfing the world with Muslims, and you got one little pocket of Catholics. Now we say Christians, they're Catholics, not Christians. How in the world did they get there? It was that deal made with the Pope, that piece remained Catholic, and it's still Catholic to this day. They haven't. You know, the Catholics they've got a mass for the Muslims. They have a Muslim mass. You know what Muslims? Islam means to submit. And a Muslim is one who has submitted. And the goal of the Muslim is to force you and me to submit. And that's what they use the sword for. But they haven't taken all of Lebanon in all these years. Anyway, that's what the Crusade's about. The first Crusade, so-called Peter the Hermit. Now listen to what the Catholic did to get these battles going. He granted plenary indulgence. Before they ever sinned, before they ever did anything, he said, if you'll go fight for me, I'll forgive you everything you do before you ever do it, so go ahead and do it because you're already forgiven for it. Now, if you really believe that dude had that power, you'd be home free, wouldn't you? And that's exactly what they were. The word crusade comes from the word crux or cross. But again, we're reminded that the cross is not a Christian symbol. It's a pagan symbol. Prisons of Europe were emptied. The worst riffraff of all were turned loose by the Catholic Church. You had the second crusade, Bernard of Clairvaux. You had the third crusade, Richard the Lionhearted, which was about the biggest failure of all of them. You had all through all of these crusades, but I want to tell you about one more crusade and I'll quit. No, a couple more. The Children's Crusade, number 10. They were running out of troops. And they convinced 30,000 children of Europe to march. They didn't get anywhere until they all got to the Mediterranean Sea. And what ones didn't die of disease and starvation, the rest of them were sold into white slavery. You don't hear much about that, do you? But that's the way it was. You hear the Crusades glorified. It wasn't anything to glorify anything or anybody. But there's one crusade that you don't ever hear about. And that is the Albigensian Crusade. Now, folks, you look back at your map, you look at Gaul, France, and southern France. In the years 1208 to 1249, there were so many Albigenses in southern France that the Pope calls a whole crusade against those brethren. Now, if you will recall, according to Perrine's book, and Dr. Crawford had that thing printed, and he's one that got that book to me, they believed and pretty much proved that the Apostle Paul planted them there when he was on his way to Spain. There were Baptists in France in the time of Paul. By the year 165 AD in Lyons, France, there was a gigantic massacre of Baptists under the rule of Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor. There were tens of thousands of Baptists that died in southern France in 165. By the year 1208, they are so thick in southern France that the Pope calls a whole crusade against them. Do you think they stopped and started again, or do you kind of think they remained there? I believe they remained there, my friends. I don't believe they ever wiped them out. I believe they stayed in those mountains and valleys, and they hid in caves, and God spared them. Now, you don't think the Albigensian crusade was true. Remember, I read you H.G. Wells to start with, and I put him down, didn't I? Because of his evolution garbage. Now I'm going to use him for my benefit. When he talks about what he knows, he does all right. But when they get in evolution, they don't know what they're talking about. I don't care who they are. And they pass off their stupid ideas as truth. It's a lie. H.G. Wells, Outline of History, on page 656. He says closely associated with the Albigenses were the Waldenses. He says, Innocent the Third. Isn't what a name for a bloodthirsty monster. That was the name of the Pope that is Innocent the Third. I bet he didn't hear that from God when he died. He won't hear innocent at the great white throne judgment. Innocent the Third, now listen to every word of this, preaching a crusade against these unfortunate sectaries. A sect is a group, a specific group. Now, this H.G. Wells is not a friend of Baptists. He doesn't pretend to be. I'm not putting him down for that. He is a disinterested witness. He says, and permitting, now, talking about Pope Innocent, the enlistment of every wandering scoundrel at loose ends to carry fire and sword and rape and every conceivable outrage among the most peaceful subjects of the King of France. The accounts of the cruelties and abominations of this crusade are far more terrible to read than any account of Christian martyrdoms by the pagans. And they have the added horror of being indisputably true. Now, this is a secular historian, non-religious at all. He says the Pope enlisted murderers, criminals of every hue, to use anything they wanted to wipe out the Albigenses. They raped the women and the little girls. They gang raped them. They skinned them alive. They chopped them in pieces. They burned them alive. They drowned them. They beat them to death. They hacked off their arms. They hacked off all of their body parts. They cut their heads off. If you've got your trail of blood handy, I guess I've got one up here. I may have to get one. Do I have a trail of blood? Here, I got it. Page 35, quickly. But persecutions did not then cease. The hated Anabaptists, Article 18, called Baptist today in spite of all prior persecution, in spite of the awful fact that 50 million already died in martyrs' deaths, still existed in great numbers. It was during this period that along one single European highway, 30 miles distance, stakes were set up every few feet along this highway, the tops of the stakes sharpened, and on the top of each stake was placed a gory head of a martyred Anabaptist. And these things have the added horror of being indisputably true. The world says we've got no right to talk about these things. Christian radio says we've got no right to talk about these things. That's what they say. Boys, you're going to have to cut my tongue out to shut me up. I'm going to talk about them. And somebody says, oh, like you're always bad-mouthing somebody. They bad-mouth themselves, friends. My cousin, a Roman Catholic, and she said, well, everybody makes mistakes. That's how they justify it. I took her a book I told the pastor today, or yesterday, called Faith of Our Fathers by Cardinal Gibbons. Catholic cardinal. He said in that book, he said, our poor priests, Jesuits, they literally wore their fingers to the bones trying to rid the world of those terrible heretics, and they could not wipe them out.